All right. Well, my name is Geoffrey Darnton. I'm the current chairman of the Reading branch of the Royal Statistical Society, and you're now attending one of our events here. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to welcome Professor James Reed, who's head of department for the economics at the University of Reading. And he's now reached the field of football with a very interesting variety of history before that. So he's worked at Birmingham, he's worked at Oxford, and now he seems to be focusing a little bit more on sport. And of course, that's why today we've got the presentation by James for looking at the effect of Covid-19 on football. And of course, the impact has been dramatic, as it has been on various other aspects of life as well. Now, for the meeting itself, I suggest that unless you really want to, you always put your hand up if you do have a question that you'd like to ask, put your hand up. Otherwise, if we take questions towards the end, and you can put questions in the chat box if you'd like to do that. And for the meeting itself, I think if people keep the cameras switched off, then that will help to reduce the actual load. I don't know how many of you've got any measures of bandwidth. I've seen recently some instances of people having their emails cut off, their access cut off because of exceeding bandwidth. And of course, the more high resolution pictures and so on that are coming down the wire to everybody's PC will in fact increase the bandwidth load, and therefore the clock will go up. So if people could keep their cameras off for the moment, I think that would be very helpful. So James, could I hand over to you for your presentation to talk about COVID-19, the effect of COVID-19 on football?
You certainly can. Thank you very much, Geoffrey, and thank you for everyone associated with this event. It's a pleasure to talk. It's fantastic to talk on the eve of the European Championships as well, which start tomorrow evening. Affected by COVID as everything else has been. And as I'm in a group of statistics-minded people who perhaps therefore have a knowledge of how forecasts can be constructed and often apply that when they're perhaps watching the game. If you are in the Reading area, the Reading group, and you're associated with the university, you may have seen in the staff portal one forecasting competition. I'll show you. I'll put the link on my first slide in a moment for another forecasting competition, which is to forecast every match of the European Championships, should you want to. And I'm just going to show you now something you can find if you follow me on Twitter, JJ Reed. You can find the only wall chart you're really going to need is this, which each QR code takes you to a Microsoft form where you can input what you think the scoreline is going to be in each of these matches. So tomorrow night's game between Turkey and Italy, you can hover over that QR code with your phone, go to the form, tell us what you think the score will be and how confident you are about it as well. And it's all a bit of fun. Thankfully, that's a little bit of fun. What I do want to share with you, though, is my slides, which are on this attempt to understand a little bit about the interaction that COVID-19 has had with sport and with football in particular over the last 16, 17 months or so. So I will. There we go. I found my slides. I will now make them into a full screen. And up to the top, so the link to go to on the university's website, it's a nice short link, rdg.ac/Euro 2000 case sensitive. Head there if you want all those links to pick and see if you can forecast better than anybody else. The idea of my talk is to talk about COVID-19 and football. It's worked with a range of different people, so I'm going to mention them here. It actually includes two people that I haven't listed here, which are Carl Singleton, also at the University of Reading, and Dominic Schreer, who works in Germany at the Otto Beisheim School of Management. It's also worked with Matthew Olczak from Aston University, Matthew Yeo, who's a PhD student of mine in Reading, and Kai Fischer and Benedikt Schmoll, who work in Düsseldorf. And the context in which I'm approaching a lot of this and the way in which I see everything that I'm kind of going to be talking about today fitting together is how economists approach sport. And that is, they think about things in terms of a contest function. So Jeffrey was saying that he hopes that all teams win. Unfortunately, all teams don't win in sporting context, and my own team, Oldham Athletic, don't win most of the time. But there's always a probability that they're going to win. So we've got some event between Team I and Team J, or participant I and participant J, and the likely outcome is some function of the effort expended, the relative effort by Team I relative to Team J. And so EI would be the effort. The lambda parameter is a parameter that dictates how discriminating the contest is, to the extent to which it distinguishes between the better teams and the less good teams, or the extent to which the outcome is fairly random, like a dice roll. But the point of this function that I think is most relevant when it comes to COVID-19 really is the cost of effort, the cost associated with effort. Putting in the effort requires some kind of cost, and those costs are probably going to differ between participants in a contest. We often think about contestants playing at home. So England kick off the European Championships, or their European Championships, on Sunday at home at Wembley. But they probably won't play all their games at Wembley, and other teams don't have the advantage of playing at home. But we imagine that the costs perhaps are lower if you're playing at home relative to if you're having to travel long distances, like Wales having to travel all the way to Azerbaijan for their opening two matches. So there's costs associated, and you imagine that COVID-19 has probably affected those costs. It's affected the cost of travel at the moment, because obviously it's much more expensive. And it's probably even harder to get to Baku now than it was in normal times. But there are other ways in which the costs have arguably been affected. The costs of putting on a certain level of effort when you're playing in a stadium without any fans, because of course we've been seeing games without any fans in the stadium, closed door football. But also players themselves have been contracting COVID-19 as well. And also there's been lots of COVID-19, varying levels of COVID-19 in local areas as well over the last 18 months or so. And we imagine that with costs of isolation and costs associated with sick leave and so on, that arguably must have an impact on the cost of producing again. If you're a football club and your kit man's gone and your groundsman's gone and all these different people because they've got COVID or they're isolating, it must be harder, more costly to produce effort. And then the other thing, of course, is that, football itself, and this is another cost, a public health cost, if you like, not necessarily cost of producing effort, but indirectly, football events have potentially been super spreaders, and hence why they've been kept away from many games. But we can also start to think about that. And of course, and I'll talk about this in a second, both football and COVID are data-rich environments, so they allow us to have a detailed look at the information and try and draw out any patterns that might be there. And so that's the main purpose of the various bits of research that I've been doing, and I'm going to present bits of tonight. Within that, I'm going to at least give a nod to a paper that I've written with Carl, looking at the demand for football in the big five leagues before COVID-19 really took off. Then a paper with Carl and Dominic looking at Belarus. Then there were lots of papers over the last year in a range of fields. So there's a paper here by Dane McCarrick and co-authors in psychology, a number of papers by economists, and of course papers in statistics and other areas looking at the same thing, which was those football matches without fans. Thinking of the reverse, the impact of football on COVID-19, there are a couple of studies about the first wave. Alexander Hammer et al. Looked at NHL hockey and NBA basketball in the US in March and the impact on cases and deaths in April. And with Matthew Olczak and Matthew Yeo, I looked at that here in England for football, and I'll present some of those results in a little while. In the second wave, there's arguably much more data because in those first few days last March and April, data collection, testing, etc., weren't quite what they are now. The data availability was different. Kai Fischer has written a paper looking at Germany in the second wave and whether football matches contributed, and I'm going to present some initial results looking at the same kind of thing here in England. So here's the rough outline of the talk. I'm going to first of all talk a little bit about those games without fans. Then I'm going to think a little bit about this level playing field idea. Well, would COVID-19 cases in local areas have impacted the cost of playing to the extent that it might have influenced outcomes over the last football season? Then I'll think about the more direct impact of COVID-19 infections on players before thinking about that reverse relationship and arguably more important relationship. Do events like football matches aid the spread of COVID-19? And it's worth saying that we're thinking here not just about the events that are in the stadium either, because of course, whilst the events have been played in stadiums with no fans, fans have been watching them or streamed on their computers or on TV, and arguably watching them, likely watching them with friends, family, in enclosed spaces where it's understood the virus transmits more effectively. So, football without fans, first of all. Pre-COVID, this was a punishment for teams with fans behaving badly generally. So, often for instance of racist abuse, for example, which is topical at the moment. But pre-lockdown, because of that, there was only a very small sample in elite football matches. We found, this was before we looked at Egypt, where they've been playing without fans for many, many years. We found in elite football, so in the European leagues and the pan-European competitions, only 160 matches prior to the first lockdown out of 34,000 matches played without any fans. And so therefore, we've got a pretty tiny treatment group, if you like, games that are being treated by having no fans in the stadium. And here's a plot of simple differences in means of what we saw in those matches. We saw a reduced home win share, which disappears once you control for team strengths. But the effect that was robust was the effect on yellow cards. Players for the away team got fewer yellow cards. We might imagine this is a mechanism through the referee, but this was the one robust effect that we found, was that players for the away team, when there were no fans, got fewer yellow cards. Since then, as I mentioned, there's been this proliferation of papers, including one by myself. Most of the papers find an effect, and there seems to be a variation in the size of the effect. What we've always found, and this is a good plot, actually, the next plot. This is a good plot to explain why we've always found that the effect is there. A reduction in the amount that the home team wins, and the increase in the amount the away team wins. But if you look over time, it's not a huge effect, actually, and there's still quite a bit of noise going on. So as a result, we see an effect, but it's generally insignificant on the home proportion of wins and the away proportion of wins as well. And it's nested within a bigger history. So this on the left-hand side, so on the right-hand side, this is month by month since 2016. On the left-hand side, this is every half year since the beginning of football, basically. And what you can see is that the home win proportion has been declining consistently for 150 years with an extra little blob COVID related. So home advantage has fallen because there aren't fans in the stadium, but it's still there, and it's been falling for many, many years before COVID. So it isn't that COVID-19 and fans in the stadium explain everything to do with home advantage. It certainly points to there being a effect, though, at any rate. And just to go back, these are the pre and post-COVID outcomes across top leagues as measured by footballdata.co.uk. And what this is pre-COVID percentage, ratio of home wins to away wins, and post-COVID ratio of home wins to away wins. So obviously, if this is 1, the home team's winning at home as much as the away team, and there's no home advantage. What you can see is E0 is the Premier League, and this is quite close to 1, whereas certainly since COVID, whereas pre-COVID it was more like 1.3. And generally points are below the 45-degree line, reflective of reduction in home advantage, but also a great variety across these different leagues. And that's something that I think people haven't really put an answer on as to why there is this great level of variation. It could simply be sample size. Of course, these are only 50 to 100 games in each of these leagues, so that could be the explanation. But there is a large degree of variation across leagues. So I'm going to spend, because the next few parts of the talk relate to the richness of the data setting, so I want to spend a little bit of time explaining that. I imagine most people here are familiar with football, and so therefore don't need me to tell them too much that football takes place all over England, and on a normal weekend, in a non-COVID time, there'd be football matches in most towns and even villages on a Saturday. And so what we've got is we've got information on matches down to the 8th tier of English football via website football web pages, and that takes you down to games with the 8 people, 20 people, 200 people. So lots and lots of football matches taking place all the way right up to the top. And so pre-COVID, you'd have generally about 150 matches taking place across 247 local administrative areas in England every Saturday. And in the run up to the pandemic, there were on March the 7th, 180 matches, and then just 42 on March the 14th, because the Premier League and the Football League suspended just before March the 14th. There's other things, of course, that we're familiar with football that makes it a very interesting context to think about the way in which the virus might spread, and that is that fans conventionally travel to away matches. They also sing and shout, something that's known to aid the spread of those particles. So that's the football side of things, and I'll show that graphically in a few moments. There's also a richness in the COVID data as well. And we're probably well aware of this via the government's dashboard, giving the numbers every day, and we can get from there daily cases, hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19. We get it on a daily basis now for almost 18 months. There's information on the alert level in these local administrative areas as well, and it goes down deeper than just local administrative areas, goes down to lower level super output areas as well. So a lot of data both through time and spatially as well. And we're kind of making advantage of that because, again, football takes place across the country. And this is just a quick introduction to the pyramid in case people aren't familiar with it. You've got the Premier League at the top. Some of these names are dated, but Championship, League 1, League 2, Reading play in the Championship, my team Oldham play in League 2. And then below that, you start to get to regional leagues. You've got what's now called the National League, the National League North-South, and then regional leagues and sub-regional leagues of regional leagues, and you get down to your parks football. This is the pyramid that's much celebrated in English football, and was something that was put into threat by the recent European Super League proposals, which proposed to abolish the movement between all of these divisions. Now, what about the number of matches taking place at these levels? This is the run-up to COVID-19. I've already hinted at this, that there are lots of matches, certainly in February, and then matches thinning out in March. And we've got a range of competitions from the ones that we're all familiar with, down to this National League North and South. And because there's North and South, therefore there are more games. And the lower you go, the more divisions, the more games. So lots and lots of games, but often with smaller numbers of fans. And this is the picture since that first lockdown, because it's worth noting that certainly at the start of the new season in September 2020, football went down all the way to these very low levels, and indeed fans were allowed in at Tier 7 and Tier 8. National League North and South and above, fans were not allowed in, apart from a small period in December and a few games in May. But with the second lockdown, most of this non-league football or non-elite football was stopped, and so you see no games since Christmas in these very lower levels. And so here's the geographic spread of football teams in those top 5 divisions. And then here's a kind of indicative plot of cases, I think it is. I can't remember since I grabbed the screenshot. But what you see is cases of COVID-19 and football teams. And you might, of course, think big correlation, but of course, these are all generally urban areas where football teams are and where lots of the COVID-19 spread has been. But there's a plot to give you an extent of the geographic spread, and also, as we've seen before, the time nature. And then just to give a bit more of a recent take on it, these are maps from the government, heat maps of the northwest, where the Delta variant has been particularly spreading. These pictures were taken only a week or so ago, but I know now the picture looks very different indeed. Lots more blue and purple all around the country, including, of course, in Reading itself. Back then, when I took this a week ago, there wasn't much doing in Reading, but you see here that we've got areas with football teams: Oxford, Swindon, Reading, Wickham, Watford, and obviously lots in London. And we've got all the data on COVID-19 happening in these places. I'll just skip past that chart. So that first question is, well, after the home advantage question, the next question was, well, was there a level playing field effect of COVID-19? Because we've got this variation in COVID-19 cases, Bolton playing Burnley perhaps, or Bolton playing Huddersfield, and very different levels of cases in the two places. Well, we can look at outcomes, because we've got all these matches taking place. Just back to here, lots of matches throughout the Football League carried on throughout the second wave since Christmas as well. And so we might ask, well, there's an outcome between team I and team J at time T, and that's going to be that might be a function of the number of cases in the last few days in area I, or the area surrounding team I, and the area surrounding team J. We also want to make sure that we're controlling for the strength of the two teams involved, and so we use an ELO prediction, so ELO ratings, and generate a prediction for the outcomes between those matches. We also include fixed effects for home and away teams, so dummy variables for each home and away team to control for their strengths. And we look at outcomes. We look at home wins, draws, and away wins, and goals and away goals, home and away goals. And we could do more, of course, because football generates lots more outcomes than just these, but this is where I started from. And so in that post second wave in particular, it's perhaps important to just show visually that there was plenty of variation in COVID cases between one place and another. So these are the simple away team area, home team area, number of cases, and you can see that in the 7 days before, there were often differences of 1,000 and more between the home and the away team. On the right hand side here, I've taken logs just so that you can get a sense of the variation within that black mass of points down there. And this is impossible to read, so don't try and crane your look too much. But these are the number of cases in an area in the 3 days before a match. This is for the home team, and so what you see is that it's the average over the entire season. And so what you see is that you've got places with lots and lots of cases. These are Birmingham, Coventry, and Aston Villa, were the places with the most cases, down to areas with very low caseloads, and then you've obviously got quite a range in between. Then you can think about the difference between the home team and the away team. So was it the case that there were lots of cases in the area of the home team and very few in the area of the away team, or vice versa? So therefore we can look at on average what each team was faced with, and again we see that on average Aston Villa, Coventry, and Birmingham were usually playing games against teams from areas with much less COVID-19. So in principle, therefore, teams with lower costs of producing effort. So what do we find if we run our regressions? Well, we find, and so here we've got first 3 columns are the home win, next 3 columns are the draw, and next 3 columns are the away win. Then we've got cases in the last 3 days, cases in the last 7 days, and cases in the last 14 days. So just trying to get a sense of whether different timescales matter. I don't think they do, but I'm just including them just so that they're all there. So what we've got here is that if there are more cases in the last 3 days in the area of the away team, then a home win is more likely. And so if this is 1,000 difference, then that's starting to become a significant effect. This is a linear probability model, so an OLS regression. So you're starting to look at an effect that might have some economic, also some real life meaning to it. More cases in the area of the home team, less likely is to be a home win, although it's not significant. And then for the draw, more cases in the area of the home team, more likely draw, more cases in the area of the away team, a draw is less likely. And then equally more cases in the area of the away team, an away win is less likely, and a home win is more likely. So away win is more likely if there are more cases in the area of the home team. So effects of a sign that you would expect, but it's worth noting that the only real significant effect is on the home win outcome. We can look at goals, and what we find is the effect here is strongest on the away team. So if all the effects again are intuitive, but if the away team, if there are more cases in the area of the home team, there are more goals by the away team. If there are more cases in the area of the away team, there are fewer away goals. This is true for cases in 3 days, 7 days, and 14 days. So there's some hint of some effect. It appears to be reasonable. There are some significance. There's some significance. Other cases are borderline, and so there may have been some impact. And those coefficients might look small, but of course, as mentioned, when you're looking at differences in the thousands, that might have an effect. Did it matter if we take those values at face value? Well, the answer is it might have mattered for Leicester City and Chelsea, who battled for the final Champions League spot. Leicester was an area, as we know, with more COVID-19 than Chelsea. So it might have been that if we adjusted for COVID-19, Leicester might have pipped Chelsea. Aston Villa would have finished higher at the table. Rather than finishing 11th, they would have finished in 9th, so it would have made a difference. And of course, it's worth noting that in the Premier League, given the magnitude of sums that are at stake, £1 million plus per league place, this would have cost Aston Villa a few million pounds. In the Championship, no effect, unfortunately. Reading still outside the playoffs, regardless of what happened. And the tight relegation race also no effect either, because there weren't significant differences in cases between those teams. Coventry would have jumped from 16th to 11th, but not huge differences. So perhaps not huge differences, but nonetheless, it's clear that there's some evidence of a non-level playing field, perhaps. But what about the very local cases, the very local COVID cases on football outcomes? Well, players have contracted COVID-19, and we're aware of this because, as I think I understand, some Spain players have contracted COVID-19 in the run-up to the European Championships. Players have been contracting it throughout the last 18 months, of course, because everyone's been contracting COVID-19. But players return, and of course, football players are highly measured individuals, if you like. Their performance on a field is much more highly measured than my performance as the head of Department of Economics at the University of Reading, for example. And so we've got an opportunity here to look at how football players return post-COVID-19 infection. And so that's exactly what we do. We've got information on players in the Bundesliga and Serie A that contracted COVID-19 when they contracted it, and then we can look at their performance both before and after their COVID-19 contraction. We can look at all sorts of measures, because what we're looking at who scored data. And so if you're familiar with the website Who Scored, it's a very data-rich resource where you can essentially find where on the field all of the various types of actions in a football match took place. And so these are all of the actions taking place on the field in the Bundesliga during the season that just finished. And so you can see marked out, I'm not totally sure why, but you can see marked out the lines on the football field. I don't know if that tells you that either footballers don't do things on the lines, or that the people that record this information don't record things as having taken place exactly on the lines. But either way, what you've got here is teams shooting from this side to this side. The black dots, which are very small actually, are all the passes. The red dots, which are slightly bigger, are all of the aerial duels, so two players heading the ball. All the green dots are shots on goal, and the blue dots are actual goals. You might notice a few blue dots here. Those are own goals, which are recorded as going into the team's own goal, whereas they're shooting towards this end. So rich data, and again, we can simply look at how did a player perform along a particular measured dimension, and how did they do once after they'd contracted COVID-19. And so this is a summary of the Bundesliga data, where essentially we find that, as you perhaps would expect, these players play less on their return. They play fewer minutes. And so this is the plot. Essentially, if we're thinking this is the pre-infection point, and then they jump down post-infection to playing fewer minutes, and there's a slow recovery. So this is up to 15 game weeks. Afterwards, and they're still below the level, although it becomes insignificant not long after. So it appears to be a slow recovery. That link didn't work. Find back where I was in my slideshow. So I won't do too much more of that. All I will say is that basically what we find is we don't find too much in terms of passing their passes. So there's a potentially actually even the idea that they're actually slightly more successful post-COVID infection in their passing, but that may mean that it's because they do fewer passes. Maybe they do safer passes, shorter passes. All these kinds of things are things that we're looking into at the moment. In Germany, they're more likely to start games and be subbed off. So they're more likely to be subbed off post-infection than subbed in, but they play fewer games. And this is 77 COVID infections that we've identified in players in the Bundesliga. In Serie A, in Italy, we have 146 identified infections. And the only real difference here, we find similar effects on minutes and the likelihood of starting, and also on passes as well, nothing much there. But we find that in Italy, it's more likely that players on their return from COVID-19 are subbed into a game rather than being subbed out. They play less, but it's more likely that they get subbed in rather than being subbed out. And we're working on this ongoing. So looking at other measures, perhaps like how often players foul other players on their return from COVID-19, because one imagines if you're off the pace, that's more likely to show up in a mistimed tackle. We're also looking at measures of network, how well networked these players are on their return, and how integral or peripheral in a game they are. So that's everything on the kind of on the COVID-19 on sport side. Then when we're thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on attendance, there's a couple of aspects of this. One of them is to what extent do we spread the virus, but also to what extent would we spontaneously self-distance? So what extent do we comply with regulations, if you like? We've been asked now for 18 months to socially distance. Do we socially distance? How do we respond to a public health crisis is one particular question. So this motivated a couple of those studies I mentioned. I looked pre-pandemic in February, March with Carl Singleton attendances in the Big Five leagues. And we found that there was an effect of cases and deaths on attendance. So people were not in huge magnitudes, but people were attending a little bit less. We also had the interesting case of Belarus as well. So Belarus carried on playing, and so you can look at. I'm going to check. No, I've not got the pictures here, but you can look at Belarus carried on playing through starting in March. Their season runs over the summer, and they carried on playing in spite of COVID-19 when every other league in the world stopped. And so we can look at the attendances there, and we did that. And what we found was that the attendances were down dramatically in the first few weeks. So evidence of spontaneous social distancing going on there. Fans deciding, even though the Belarusian president took a very hardline attitude against COVID-19 and not taking restrictions and bearing it like a man kind of statements, lots fewer fans turned up at games. That effect was quite short-lived though, because by the time you got into May type time, April, May, attendances were beginning to return to something more like their normal levels. So a short-lived effect. And Dominic Schreers also looked at the impact of terrorist incidents on attendance at football matches and found something similar. An initial reduction, public health threat, and a return after a while. And I mentioned earlier on that in those Tier 7 and Tier 8, so regional leagues, fans were allowed back into games. So here in Didcot, where I live, Didcot Town was allowed to have fans into the stadium. And what we've looked at that, and what we found is actually there was a boon in attendances. In the season 2020-21, attendances at these lower level games were about 10 to 15% higher than they were normally. So based on a normal, we've got in here fixed effects or dummies for each team. And we're also controlling for the fact that there might be league clubs in an area as well. So the number of league clubs and the number of Premier League clubs and the effect on attendance at these very low levels. What we find is that there's no, the interaction between there being Football League and Premier League clubs wasn't particularly significant in that boom. It was just simply a boom in attendance of 10 to 15% more in those months, September, October, November, December, at very low level football. So it means that Didcot Town, normally getting 200 fans, maybe they got 230 fans coming along instead. So a noticeable difference. And again, kind of consistent with this idea that after a while, well, perhaps it's pent-up demand, but either way, fans were returning in reasonably normal, if not more than normal levels as they did pre-pandemic. And this is something that obviously is going to concern the Football League and the Premier League, certainly more the Football League than the Premier League, as football returns in the new season when fans will hopefully be back. Will they be back in lower numbers than they were because of some kind of an initial public health effect, like in Belarus? Or will they come back in increased numbers as they came back in the Tier 7 and Tier 8 last autumn? Finally, I'll spend a few moments talking about the effect, the extent to which these football matches are spreaders of the virus, because we've got all these measures of how many football matches took place in different areas, and measures of how many people attended at these games as well. And so we can look at that, and also the capacity constraints as well. I skipped past the plot, but just to skip back to it, this is a plot of the percent of capacity filled in the 2019-20 season in English football, down those 8 tiers. So you can see that most games are only between 0 and 20% full in the stadium, with a bit of a blip or a bit of an increase of games towards the top end. These are generally Premier League matches. So we can look at all sorts of measures of how much football was taking place, whether it was taking place in full stadiums or in half-empty stadiums. And then we can look at whether there was any impact on COVID-19 cases in a local area afterwards. And so here we've got a regression model up here, linear regression model of some measure of the spread of the virus, measure YI in area I, and some measure of football in area I, where measure M we've taken to be the number of matches, the total attendance, and a measure of capacity utilization, which we actually just take the thresholds. So if a game, we count the number of games that had 90% or more full stadium, the number of games that had 80% or more, and so on. We also, because we were in the initial estimation, we were only looking at a cross-sectional analysis. We were looking at these areas in April, a number of football matches taking place in March. We therefore felt it was important to include area controls. So population density, for example, the age profile, the income, ethnic breakdown, because all of these things are thought to affect the spread of the virus, so that we could distinguish between different areas, because we might find that there are more cases in areas with football clubs, but it could well be because of the characteristics of areas with football clubs rather than because there were more football matches at the time. This is the data, so this is the variation in cases through to April and May in 2000 and 2020. This big outlier is Bower and Furness, but the vast majority are lying in this range here. These are distributions of deaths in March and April across England from COVID-19 as well, just to give you a sense of the data, and to give you an initial idea of what the method is we're saying, well, these games took place in March. So the biggest day was the day I mentioned, where there was 180 games on the 7th of March, and just 40 odd games on the 14th of March. But these were all the games that took place. And then, well, what did cases look like by the time we got into the end of April? Excuse me. And what we've got here is we've got the red line are the 126 areas where there were no matches, but then there was one match in 94 areas, and that's this orange line here, which is certainly higher. I haven't plotted any confidence bars, but I'm going to show you some plots that do have confidence bars in a moment. This one area here that's got a very high rate, well, that is one simple area that had 5 matches. Buckinghamshire has a lot of these very small football teams, for example. And so these are the results, probably quite hard to see, but what these are 6 plots where on the top line we have no controls for these characteristics of local areas. And on the bottom set of plots, the bottom row, we've got controls, so population, income, ethnic breakdown, and so on. We've got cases on the first column, deaths on the second column, and excess deaths on the third column. Then what we've got is a blob, is a coefficient, and a line is the standard error bars. So if this coefficient, for example, is significant, and that one is the capacity measure. We have a continuous capacity measure, which is somewhat, well, basically, it's not the one I'm going to focus on, even though it is perhaps arguably the most significant coefficient. What I'm going to focus on are these more discrete intervals of capacity. So the black blobs here are, black blob is the number of cases after a game with more than 10% full stadium, a number of cases after a game with 20% or more full stadium, all the way up to 90%. And the black blob suggests something that we might think is intuitive: more games with a more packed stadium, more COVID-19 cases. The red blobs are for a capacity in a game, or a crowd in a game with less than that threshold. And this effect appears to be stronger if we go into COVID-19 deaths as well, for example. But we're not controlling for those characteristics of areas. And once we do that, things change quite a bit. And so what you see now is that the black dots are not rising as steeply, and in fact waving, if you like, certainly staying around zero. But the consistent effect is actually these games with less than a certain threshold of the capacity, particularly in the deaths table here, but also here. These are two-tailed, of course, when the confidence intervals are plotted here, but we're only interested if that coefficient is greater than 0 or not. And so certainly when we get to up here, we're looking at effects that are borderline significant in a statistical sense, and arguably worrisome. If we're seeing this in a regression model, we wouldn't want to simply discard it as being insignificant just because it's fairly borderline significant. The effect on deaths is significant. And as I say, this is consistent across capacity. So it isn't actually the case, once we control for the characteristics of local areas, that there are more cases if the crowds, if the stadiums are more full. The effect's consistent regardless of how full or empty the stadium is. The effect is about 6 cases per match, about 2 COVID-19 deaths and 3 excess deaths per football match that took place in March in England. And our rationalisation of that is that it's all of those ways in which you watch a football match in normal times and where you're not outside. So normally you're outside the stadium watching the game, but you'll travel to the game in a car with your friends or on a bus or on a train. You will queue for the toilets, you will queue to get a burger and a drink under the stadium in the concourse, or you'll go in a clubhouse if you're a non-league stadium. So all sorts of ways in which you might end up transmitting the virus. You'll queue to get into the stadium, you'll crowd to get out as well at the end in compressed spaces. And of course, fans congregate together, sing songs, and so on. So it appears to suggest that there's a risk there. Now, thinking about, and there's lots more detail there. I'm not going to spend any time in it because there's not much time in this talk, but the detail is there. And there's a paper in a journal called COVID Economics that you can look at to get a little bit more sense of the details. The second wave, we've got more data, of course, and so what we can think about is potentially a different approach. So this is an approach that, I'm still somewhat tentative about because it's a panel time series approach. We've got obviously all these different areas, and we've got their data through time. And so in my mind, we therefore should think about explaining, for example, cases in a local area by cases in recent days, because we know that cases grow exponentially, as they unfortunately are doing again at the moment with the Delta variant. And so easily, you imagine with a data series like that, which is non-stationary in nature, the best way to capture its variation is to include plenty of lags, and 1 to 14 lags to capture this idea that, well, there's a certain incubation period for COVID-19. If we were to model just COVID-19 cases on 14 lags across all areas in the UK, these are local authority areas, throughout the last 14, 15 months or so, that would have an R-squared of 0.999. Nonetheless, not massively informative because it's just telling you that cases yesterday predict cases today. But what that also means is that it's going to be quite a hard job for any measure of football activity in that local area to find a significant effect. Because what we've got here is we've got cases on the 14 previous days cases, lag-dependent variables, and then we've got whether there was a football match in those previous 14 days. So if there was a football match, that would be 1. If there was 2, it would be 2, and so on. And we're going to do the same for deaths as well. With deaths, arguably, to get more explanatory power, we should also include cases from a previously distant point. So the first 14 lags are deaths. and lags 15 to 28, it should be. It's a typo I've not corrected, because we record deaths within 28 days of a positive test. We include cases, and then we also include, well, were there any football matches in that period 1 to 28? And then we can simply see, well, was there any impact over and above what we can see in the usual trends for COVID-19 cases and deaths over the last 14, 15 months or so? And the results are troubling. So these are the coefficients on the lags. So these are the number of days after a football match took place. So, for example, this would be a football match. Sorry, 0 should be 1, and 14 is 13. So this is the 14 days after. If there's a football match, then there's a significant coefficient for 14 days later. So this points to this incubation period, and what we've got is essentially positive coefficients throughout. Football matches appear to be consistent still with increases in COVID-19, and that's in the time since the first wave. So whilst games have been on TV, whilst games have been sometimes with fans in the lower leagues. So that's cases. And then we've got deaths. Here we've got something that's creeping up slowly. So you see that in the immediate time after a match, there's nothing obviously significant, but it's creeping up slowly. We're starting to get significant coefficients after about day 25. So again, this is the kind of timeline you might expect pre-vaccination. It's worth also noting, but this is an effect you might expect if somebody contracts COVID-19 from having observed a football match, be it with their friends in a pub or in their house, or even in the stadium. And then they've contracted the virus and ended up hospitalized, and then with the unfortunate outcome. So I don't present these results with any sense of happiness. I'd rather find nothing there. I think if there was nothing there, that upward trend probably wouldn't be there. But again, this is something that I think is potentially there for discussion. If I was opening up sporting events, I think this kind of pattern would give me all sorts of food for thought. This is taking place even when games are in empty stadiums, so it would suggest to me that as we do start to return to football and sport more broadly, there's going to need to be a lot of caution, as there's been pilot events, test events with 20-odd thousand at the FA Cup final, and so on. With time in mind, I will wrap up. This has been a data-focused attempt to understand the impact of COVID-19 on football, and also football on COVID-19. And of course, these kinds of conclusions matter for broader public health decisions about tournaments like the European Championships beginning tomorrow. The conclusions appear to be, well, there's reduced home advantage that we probably all know about because of the empty stadiums. There's also some limited evidence of an impact of a unlevel playing field between teams in areas with more and fewer COVID-19 cases. There's limited evidence that fans spontaneously social distance, and there's also potentially some evidence that fans will return once they're allowed to in greater numbers, hopefully as we move towards the autumn. And finally, there's this evidence to suggest that football matches may be super spreaders, giving more food for thought and more reason to be cautious as fans do return to football matches in the coming months. So I shall stop there, and I'm happy to take any kinds of questions people have.
Thank you very much indeed, James. That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that there was so much data. You've got some very interesting, rich data sets there to be able to work with. I suppose if I had one question, have you been able to separate out? I noticed that you seem to have combined all the different ways of watching games. Have you been able to separate out the effects of watching a game in a stadium separately from watching games everywhere else?
So it's possible to, of course, and so I've done a little bit of that. And so actually what I'll do is, you can see here I've got these links to matches with a concourse and matches with a clubhouse. So my PhD student, Matthew Yeo, very diligently went through and characterised all stadiums for clubs as either having a concourse, so being a stadium like Reading Stadium, or having a clubhouse, so a non-league stadium like Didcot Town's small stadium here in Didcot. And that is one way in which you can split them up. You can, of course, look at only matches in the Premier League, only matches in the Football League, and so on. And so what I did was I did a little bit of looking at the matches with a concourse. And so these are matches with a concourse. And of course, these are all Football League and Premier League. So there were no fans in the stadium for these games, pretty much. And so this arguably is more of these are people watching it at home on a television or some other way other than watching it in the stadium. And then the clubhouse matches, well, these are almost certainly these matches with fans in attendance, or more likely to be matches with fans in attendance. And you can do a kind of a simple time series calculation to work out what the long run, or what the coefficient of the full effect of a single match is. And that suggests that these matches have a smaller effect, the matches where fans are actually present, these non-league matches, than the Premier League Football League matches, which is potentially a function of the number of people watching. Of course, more people will be watching these matches, fewer people will be watching these matches, but a similar pattern in each case.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Do we have any questions? Any other questions?
Yes, we have 2 hands raised. So let's go to Shanti first and then Jill.
Yes, thank you, James. Fascinating, as Greg said, that thank you very much for giving us a fantastic presentation. I've got 2 questions, actually. One is on data, and the other question is on communicating the results to the end users. On the data side, I know you mentioned this very rich in data. So do you have lots of raw data which you need to process and then sort of analyze it? And if that's the case, I mean, how do you manage that? Because it's masses of data, isn't it? And my second question is, do you actually link with the clubs, the football clubs, and have you actually communicated some of your results to the managers or the footballers or the organizations who might find this very, very useful to take it forward in their own organization?
Yeah, thanks. In terms of the making sense of the data itself, yeah, it can be a tricky job. I was fortunate enough to have Matthew, my PhD student, to do a lot of the work in terms of making sure the local area is matched up to a particular club. And because obviously the data from the COVID dashboard, the government's dashboard, has the codes for each local area, and so then you've got to match each team with its local area. And so there's quite a bit of manual legwork there. But essentially, once that's done, and you collect the data from the same source, essentially, you can still carry on doing it. So we can update, and it will be interesting to look at the post-vaccine effect on these plots as well. It may well already be factored in because they're estimated up to about March. But yeah, it's certainly there's quite a lot of steps involved, and merging data sets and making sure that there aren't too many gaps and too many holes in there. In terms of communicating, a little bit. So I had a meeting with someone who was involved in the initial attempts after the first wave to open events up, but of course, not long after that, those attempts were abandoned because the second wave arrived. Since then, I've not really had too much interaction. That's mainly just because, as many of us are probably aware, we're just about getting to the end of the academic year, and so I've been rather busy, unfortunately, with the day job, sadly. But I think these are potentially more likely to be findings that would be taken alongside the kinds of pilot studies that are still carried out, or trials that are being carried out with small numbers of fans being at stadiums, and tracking and tracing the actual fans that attend, because these are merely correlations. We can try and establish as much as possible, there's some kind of relationship there, but it is really just simply correlation, because we're not tracking and tracing the individuals that were in attendance and seeing whether or not they they contracted COVID. And as I understand, most of those up until recently that have been going to these events haven't been contracting the virus. So it does suggest that there are ways to make these kinds of events safer. Caveat again, of course, is that if people are still watching games on TV in their living rooms as we're going for the European Championships, there's not a lot that anybody can do about that. I don't think anyone wants to not show football matches on TV, especially when the European Championships are on.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, Jill, go ahead.
Is it me? It's Jill Matheson here.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. My question actually links to what you ended up just saying, which is about the events research programme being run from DCMS with these test events. And two questions. One is, of course, there are no away fans at those test events. And given what you've said about the capacity for spread from going to games and travelling to games rather than just, excuse me, rather than actually being there. I wonder if there was any kind of insights you could give on that. And secondly, on the programme itself, whether you've had any discussions with the DCMS team, or, I mean, one of the things I've been pressing is that they should make the results available very quickly and presumably the data available for some further analysis, but I wondered if they've had any interest in what you've been doing up until now.
So on the first question with away fans, I'm someone that lives 200 miles from my own team, so I mostly attend away matches. So it's one of these effects. It's one of these effects where I don't want there to be an effect there. But with that first wave study, we could look at games involving a region. So, for example, Liverpool plays Bournemouth. We can look at the effect of that game taking place in Liverpool on the cases in Bournemouth, and we found a similar effect, both in Liverpool and Bournemouth for that particular example, for the reasons that you mentioned and I mentioned earlier on as well. I think, because you would travel to these kinds of games, so I do worry about away fans and the potential that we can open games to away fans. Certainly, because I think it stands to reason that if there's an effect of a match taking place, it's certainly going to be an effect on away fans as well. And given the exponential spread, it doesn't matter that there's fewer of those away fans; they're still going to be spreading it back in their local area. Again, these are all pre-vaccine effects, so I don't really know what the effect's going to be like since. In terms of contacting with DCMS and so on, as I mentioned, no. I quite happily make these kinds of things available. As I mentioned, I had a conversation on the back of the first wave work, but then that conversation happened around about the time when everything was abandoned because the second wave really took off. So I've not had much contact. I'd be more than open to contact and conversations, though.
Do you mind if I put them in touch with you then?
Very happy, Jill.
Great, good, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? If there isn't, I'd like to shoot a question or two. So firstly, very interesting talk and very, very, very fascinating results. I was wondering if there's any sort of causal analysis that's been done on conditioning on various possible competing causes. For instance, in the as an example, I think on slide 7 you had this lovely geographical map, and you mentioned that a lot of the you correlated the cases with the venues, but then the venues are also coincident with the density of the higher densities of population. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, when I had those conversations with people associated with pilot events back last summer, this was one of the things that they said was, well, can you trace, the people that were there to the cases? And I can't. These are merely correlations. Fundamentally, the role of those control variables, certainly in that first analysis for the first wave, the role of the control variables is to try as much as possible to make all those areas similar to each other, such that the only thing differing between them is the number of football matches taking place. And that's as far as we can. I think I can really go with this data in terms of establishing anything really causal.
Well, thanks. That's very interesting to know.
I mean, yeah, I'm sure you know how it is with data. I mean, it's one of those things where we might want to dismiss that. So it's correlations, it's not causal. But when it's deaths involved in COVID-19 cases, you probably want to be looking into it in a bit more detail. And so again, I think the pilot studies and so on, games with small numbers of fans and the fans being traced and so on, is the really important step to be taken, given this.
On the tracing, if I may briefly ask this, so there are track and trace efforts, right? So, but these don't extend to football games as such.
Well, I think the more recent games that have had fans have had that. Okay. So there's been much more of an effort to make sure that obviously fans are vaccinated or they've had tests very recently, and I imagine therefore that there's following up in the way that the NHS app follows you up and so on now.
Exactly. Cool. Thanks.
Thank
Are
you.
there any other questions? Well, if not, let's once again thank the speaker. And Jeffrey, do you want to give a shout out?
Yes, I just had one question. With the huge volume of data, had you thought or tried tossing it all into one big pot and using factor analysis to see if there are any underlying variables that account for the variance?
Not yet, but it's an interesting idea. I will have a look at that and get back to you.
Yeah, that's that's often my starting approach, particularly when we've got so many points and so many different data sets. And for me, the question then would be just that: is that if I run a factor analysis routine on this, will it pick up any specific factors that account for the variance, and then of course look for correlations to make those factors meaningful in real life rather than just statistical artifacts. So I was just curious about that. But no, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the talk. Absolutely fascinating. And as I say, I'm really impressed at the amount of data and the models that you're producing to try and draw out the significance of some of the information that you've looked at. It's wonderful. And so on behalf of the group, I'd just like to thank you very much for doing the presentation. And
thank you for having me.
And maybe sometime we'll come back in a year or two's time when you might have more data on vaccinations, maybe see if factor analysis gives you any ideas about other underlying variables that could be accounting for it. But absolutely fascinating world to
and hopefully in person as well in a year or two's time.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so thank you once again very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Anybody else with any
James.
final comments or questions?
No, we can clap our hands online. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.